Hello everyone, this is Mini Ninja speaking. Welcome to what I admittedly have to dub a bit of a bootleg breakdown light episode of the Legend Creation Jiren figure, for reasons that'll become apparent a little more later. What we're going to do, for those not familiar with the general show format, is we take a general look at the bootleg itself, kind of a first comparison. If I have the legitimate figure, then we do a side-by-side comparison in order to see how the articulation and various aspects of the figure stack up. And what I normally do at the end is a bit of a teardown just to really look at the bare components. But we're going to be kind of curtailing that a smidge as I do kind of a more side-by-side comparison for this particular video in terms of the parts and such. Now, for the actual original unboxing and general impressions, as you can tell from most Legend creations, they all come with a bit of a flimsier plastic around the figure to kind of help hold it in place during shipping, which is no different than normal here. And once you get this particular Jiren out of the packaging, admittedly, he does have a bit of a stockier build, or at least for what most bootlegs have. However, once you get past the issue of getting him to stand, which admittedly is something that is a bit of an issue with the real Jiren, because of how thin his ankles are compared to the rest of the body, you can kind of tell there is something slightly off about the fellow. This is something that I consider a general quote-unquote feature of most Legend Creation figures, and that's the fact that rather than try to recreate the original joint setups in the upper body, namely the butterfly joints, the real neck joints, etc., they end up making a slightly smaller version of the upper body, with all that stuff kind of removed and made into a solid chunk to make it easier and cheaper to replicate. Unfortunately, it also has the side effect of really removing any upper body movement for the ab crunch whatsoever. There's absolutely none here at all. It can't even get the budge. And also, it tends to affect other bits like the neck movement and a little bit on the waist movement as well to certain degrees, just because they're kind of general fitting issues all along. You probably noticed there are the indents of where the butterfly joint would be, but they're strictly casted in and they're not actually functional. Same thing with, in this case, the hip joints, which, although they do have a little more give than most of their general figures, they are indeed fake 2.0 joints. And speaking of fake joints, the knees and elbows in this figure are similar. They have the right amount of range for what the figure should have. However, you can see they're much uglier joints in general, and in Jiren's case, they're much bigger in terms of the knee joints. However, surprisingly enough, the ankle and toe joints are fully functional in this figure, if not a bit loose, if anything, which is something I don't get to say a lot, to be quite frank. So they actually do work as they're supposed to, maybe need a little tightening if anything. Can't say the same about the neck, no, the neck has no real movement. Now here's the more side-by-side comparison. Surprisingly, the shorter figure is the real one in this instance. The bootleg, because the upper body has been kind of misshapen a bit, actually sits a little taller than what the real body should have. Same with the knee joints, which are, as you can see, notably bigger on the bootleg compared to the real deal, which is why the bootleg Jiren is actually taller than the real deal by, I'm going to say, about a centimeter or so. Now, for part of the reason why we're doing a little bit of a deviation for this episode is because the original SH Figuarts Jiren figure does have some quality issues that do need to be addressed, namely the shoulder and kind of arm pegs when you're trying to switch for the crossed arm pose. The way they set it up, some of the figures definitely coming out a little too tight in terms of how the joints fit on there, so if you try to remove them, you might accidentally snap them in some cases. You'll know this is a problem if you have a particularly squeaky set of shoulders on your figure here. So what I want to really look at for this particular bootleg is how interchangeable certain parts can be. So, of course, on that note, you are going to have some issues where, like for the butterfly shoulders and the hips in this case, you're not going to be able to do a proper switch back and forth because the bootleg figure, unfortunately, just doesn't have the comparable joints as part of its sculpt here. As you can see from Jiren and his much larger set of splits than what the bootleg can do. That being said, there are a number of parts that would be fairly interchangeable with very minor work. Like, well, you can see the elbow here is a little different here. However, the actual shoulder joint, the rotating part, they're actually fairly similar, as well as the size of the arms and forearms there. Although the forearms on the bootleg are not as defined, I should say. Here's a look at how the neck joints look. As you can see, bootleg is the one that's more purpley on the left there. And admittedly, there is a bit of a size difference in terms of the size of the pegs. I feel that the bootleg one is actually a smidge larger. They are actually the right shape in order to kind of be modifiable in order to fit on the real deal. Just for a general comparison, I haven't done any modification work on the real figure or the bootleg for this particular one. However, even though it's not a perfect fit, you could probably modify the bootleg head there in order to fit on the real body with maybe just a little more of a clearing space. Whereas if you try to fit the real head on the bootleg body, it'll actually just slip on right there. It's not a tight fit, but it will go right on with no real issue. And that's because the one on the real figure is a slight bit smaller. That being said, it's honestly not going to be a huge amount of work in order to get it fit in because it's the right general shape, which is almost never really the instance for most of these figures. Looking at the general accessories here, admittedly, they're actually not half bad for the most part. You can kind of tell the difference though between the interchangeable arms. There definitely are not immediately interchangeable, unfortunately. There is definitely a different size of the peg in terms of how they fit on there, or at least it would take a little more work for that one. However, in terms of the heads, other than the bootleg being maybe a little more glossy because they don't have a proper matte coat on it, and having a little less in terms of the detailing, I'm going to try to make that a little more emphasized on some of the next heads. They honestly aren't terrible fits, and the decals for the most part aren't that bad on the bootleg heads. In fact, aside from the different finish and the fact that the kind of wrinkle marks aren't as defined on the bootlegs, they're fairly interchangeable if I'm being totally frank. The only other thing being the openings on the bottom, of course. And of course a little bit of scuff mark on this one, but that's a quick fix. All in all, they're actually not that bad, and if you really did want to use one for a custom in a pinch, you probably could get away with just modifying one of the bootleg ones. Now, for the hands themselves, unfortunately it is a case where the bootleg does have slightly softer features, but all in all it's not too bad, that's easy to fix. Maybe a little extra shading that's on the real hand, but a little bit of paintwork will honestly address that. And in terms of sizing, they're fairly comparable. I said, like, the bootleg is maybe a smidge smaller, but it's not overly noticeable. It's not like some of the other different Legend Creations figures I've looked at as of late. And frankly, if I didn't bring it up, you might not necessarily notice in some of these cases for some of these hands. The only thing I might note is maybe that the peg on the bootlegs is slightly larger, so you might want to make a slight modification in order to fill up the space. In fact, to help emphasize that a bit more, let's remove the bootleg hand, let's get the real one on there, do a proper side-by-side. The only thing I will note for the bootleg, and this will come up again later I'm afraid, is that the wrist joint on the bootleg does not move particularly well. In fact, on mine, they feel very stiff. So you can see a bit of a side-by-side. The real one is a bit smaller and does stick out more, which allows for a little bit more movement, although at least in my figure, the wrist joints are actually a bit too loose, which is something I will have to fix on my own figure later. Moving onward, the Jiren figures tend to have something special in terms of their effect pieces, namely the glowing fire bits here, which you can see there is a notable difference on this one. Namely the real one, which is a little less opaque, has a much better gradient than what the bootleg has, and is also, like I said, more opaque, which basically means it's not as see-through in this case. While the other one is fairly transparent. Same goes for the fists actually, the bootleg one being on the left there. While it doesn't look half bad by any means, it is notably more transparent than the real one. And just for proof of concept, let's get the glowing fist on there of the bootleg. Fits just fine, as you can see. And honestly, once you get, even if it's on its own, much less with the fire one, it doesn't look half bad, to be quite frank. And it does fit on there comfortably. With a little work, just a little pressure to get it in, you kind of have to line it up a certain way, and it does work. And you can get it to also fit in with the real one if you need to. It's maybe a little more snug fit, I wouldn't push it too hard, but it will work, just for point of reference. And speaking of reference, here's what the real one looks like on the real figure. Which, one second, got to get a little more work to get on there. As you can see, it's honestly, it looks pretty good. And with the flaming head, well, fits on there no problem. Speaking of it, here's a proof of concept here. Namely, we're going to take the real fire effect off. This is the bootleg one going on the real hand. And frankly, it actually seems to work for the most part pretty good. I would not suggest, however, pushing it all the way in, just because there is a slight difference in terms of the clearing size, and you can accidentally get the bootleg in there if you really put too much force. However, if you need to replace it on a pinch, that will do the job. Speaking of which, we're actually going to take a look at the bootleg figures version of the Son Goku hair bit, and put it on the real figure here. So, in order to get that, you can see maybe there is a slight bit of difference in terms of the quality of the shade of blue on there, and a small little etch in terms of like a improper casting marking of some sort. However, with a little bit of a wiggling in order to get that there, just to make sure that the hair and the pins fit on flush on there, I actually found it was not too hard in order to get the bootleg part in order to fit on the real figure here. If anything, you might need to slightly bend the figure, or maybe warm it up a bit in order to get it to achieve the proper bend, but even without a lot of work, I didn't heat it up in this case. Yeah, it's a good flush fit on there. This last group of shots here was actually a very deliberate choice, because with Jiren with the cross arms here, it helps demonstrate a few different things at once. Namely, as you can see, the arms are about the right size in order to fit over something with a wider upper body, or in this case, a proper figure with some butterfly joints that would give it the extra range they would normally need. And in terms of the elbows and shoulder joints themselves, they're actually surprisingly competently done. Aside from being maybe a little lesser quality casting, you could probably actually get this figure if you really needed some replacement parts for the real Jiren. You could probably just take the shoulders or arms or something off this bootleg figure and get them to fit on the real deal, for that matter. So, in terms of that, I'd almost say this figure was worth it just for parts alone, to be quite frank, because honestly, the arms, for the most part, are done very competently. The one true Achilles heel on this particular figure has to be the wrist joints, however. Unfortunately, at least on my figure, they're actually slightly off-center on both cases, but they're completely stuck to the walls of the figure in this case, or the walls of the wrist. And my attempts to get them to move, unfortunately in this case, caused one of them to snap right off. It was a clean break, mind you, but still, that's something that was pretty much unnecessary, as the hands were able to stick on there just fine. As you can see, I did manage to get it patched up, and with a bit of a brass pin work as well as some glue, it is back on there, and it's a nice sturdy fit once more, but that's a lot of work for what would otherwise have been the last shot of the video prior to conclusion. So I guess this has become my conclusion shots of sorts. In terms of my general opinion, aside from the wrists, I'm actually going to give this figure a pass as kind of a cheap alternative to the real deal, as well as a potential parts figure. On that note, thanks for joining us, folks. Hopefully you'll join us next time as we take a look at the fake Figma Bakugo from the My Hero Academia series. So long for now.